Hi, this is Mr. Smith, and I'll be talking to you about poverty and economic inequality. And this is part of Honors Economics Unit 2, Public Sector Economics. So in this presentation, I'll be talking to you about the poverty line, what's known as the poverty trap, safety nets, which are meant to capture people from falling into poverty or at least pull them up out, income inequality, measurements and causes, and government policies to reduce income inequality. And this is a picture of a protest movement that occurred in the early 2010s, and that would be Occupying Wall Street. The Occupy movement, which is what it was called, basically was protesting against the perceived notion of income inequality, that there was a lot of wealthy billionaires and corporations that were able to succeed without, in the Occupy movement's terms, not paying their fair share of taxes, and that there are a lot of people being kept at subservient poverty rates for wages, and that the gap between the working class and the poor in particular and the wealthy just kept growing and growing and growing. And it included unions and people that were in support of anti-poverty programs and those that work with charities to help the poor, and people against global capitalism and the idea that corporations are being ruinous to third world countries and so on. But just to look at some of these terms, poverty is measured by the number of people who fall below a certain level of income, called the poverty line. And the poverty line is the specific amount of income one requires for a basic standard of living. So whenever we talk about the poverty rate, that's the percentage of the population that falls below this poverty line. And the poverty line is different for groups of people based on how many people there are per household, for instance. So the amount of income needed to sustain the basic necessities, particularly food, for a one-person household in the year 2020 is about $12,760. For two people, it's $17,240. For three people, it's $21,720. Now, the reason why that doesn't go up in proportional amounts is because you already have a house that you're paying for, so you don't need to pay double rent if you have a child, and you don't need to pay double heat. But there are some things that are going to go up: the amount of clothing you need to buy, the amount of food, and so on. But anyway, the poverty line, that specific amount, it changes with inflation, and it's calculated for the whole country. But notice, that might seem enough. Like one person might be able to make it without too many nice things, not really any luxuries in Titusville for a little over $12,000. But in Manhattan or Silicon Valley out in California, that's going to be impossible. So this is a national average, which is one of the deficiencies of the poverty line. Income inequality compares the share of the total income or wealth in society that different groups receive, and the poverty rate is the percentage of the population below the poverty line in any given year. So that percentage I mentioned, if there's a 12% poverty rate, that is the amount of people in poverty below the poverty line. So when you see those statistics and those numbers are talking about these three dealing with poverty, income inequality is something different. When you hear, for instance, the top 20% of income earners in the United States control 50% of the wealth or 50% of the resources, and the bottom 20% only control 5%. That's what they're talking about when it comes to income inequality. Here you can see the U.S. poverty rate since 1960, which was about 18%, and then the Great Society programs were introduced, which really makes up a lot of the welfare programming we have today. When we talk about welfare, first of all, it's a general term. Social welfare is the well-being of everyone. So really any type of program, even programs that help teachers or veterans or whatever, could be technically social welfare. But of course, that has a negative connotation. So people don't like it when you use that word to describe other programming. So typically when we talk about it in the United States, we're referring to programs to help people stay out of poverty or to assist those with needs. And so the first of these welfare programs were like Social Security, for instance, created back during the Great Depression. But once again, we pay taxes into that, although we only are paying part of the taxes. The other taxes are paid by employers, which a lot of people don't realize. We pay half, they pay half. And then because cost of living goes up over time, we actually get more back than we paid in according to the dollar amount. So I'm just making numbers up here, but if we paid in $50,000 over our lifetime, if we are retired for 30 years and live 30 years past retirement age, which for people that are currently on Social Security was 65 for most of us, it will be 67 because that's scheduled to go up slowly. And perhaps some people say it should go up even more. But if you live for 30 years, 67 to 97, you're going to earn a lot more back than you personally paid in. And more maybe even than your employers contributed on top of that. So that is because, especially as people are living longer and there's more and more people alive later in that age, basically they have taken all the money that was put aside for Social Security, and now they're just living off the Social Security taxes that those that are currently working are paying. Some libertarians and critics call it a Ponzi scheme. But anyway, because people pay into it, Social Security, referenced as welfare once again, is looked at negatively. If you're elderly and you're using Social Security and you hear it described as welfare, you'll become irritated by that. But that's really what it is. But the modern idea of welfare is something everyone can agree on: food stamps, temporary assistance for needy families, which is cash payments, and so on. Those are what people think of when it comes to welfare. And those were created during the Great Society period, which is why we took a stronger interest in poverty and also why this chart keeps track of it back to that point. You can see the poverty rate dropped from 18% to 10%. And each of these periods of time, there's a brief recession in the early 80s, there's a brief recession in the early 90s. This is the Great Recession, so you can see it peaks at those points. But otherwise, the poverty rate, the baseline in non-contractionary periods, is staying around 10%, sometimes dropping a little bit lower than that. So that 8% drop is impressive. And you can see here 2013, it's already down to 14.5%. In the year 2019, the poverty rate is 10.5%, which is impressive. So you can see once again it's back down to 10, and then obviously once COVID happened, it's going to increase again. But that's a pretty amazing. In non-contractionary years, it's dropped by 8% or so. But the question is, how do we get it to go even further? And what should we do about that? And some people say, well, maybe we shouldn't do anything about that. And maybe it didn't drop because of the Great Society programs and modern welfare. Maybe it dropped because of economic productivity and technology and increased standard of living. Maybe that's what caused it to drop. And so maybe we don't need the poverty programs, and we can just get rid of them. And of course, that's a big gamble, because what happens if it does go back up to 18%? And then people say, well, who cares? What does it matter? We're supposed to take care of ourselves. We're supposed to work. What does it matter if other people are in poverty? And of course, referring back to the previous lecture, we talk about the social benefit. Is there a social benefit to having less people in poverty? And most economists would answer the question with yes, although they would diverge on how exactly we deflate poverty rates. But the poverty rate fell dramatically in the early 1960s. It rose in the early 80s and 90s. Once again, these are because of economic contractions. When the gross domestic product was falling, there were recessions that were occurring. After declining in the 1990s through mid-2000s, rose to 15.9% in 2011, once again because of the economic recession. In 2013, the poverty level dropped by 14.5%, and then before COVID started, it dropped to 10.5%. So that's evidence that 10% is the non-contractionary level that has stabilized in the United States. Can you give people too much help or the wrong kind of help? When people are provided with food, shelter, healthcare, income, and other necessities, this instance may reduce their incentive to work, and that makes sense. Poverty trap is an anti-poverty program set up so that government benefits decline substantially as people earn more income. As a result, working provides little financial gain. And so this is one of the problems with trying to put moral values into government programs, especially those involving anti-poverty. Look what people say. They say, oh, they're poor. Why do they have so much money saved? Why are they still getting assistance if they're working? And so as someone's income rises, they put in more hours or get a promotion or whatever, then their benefits will perhaps decrease or even be cut. And so then they fall right back into the place they were before. But that's because people don't want them, like they're poor. Why are they saving up? Or why do they have all this money? And so when government programs are designed like that to decrease benefits or even cut them off after a while, after they get to a certain point in income, many economists would say, well, actually, instead of providing a corrective act and a type of auditing on the program, what it does is it discourages people from putting in more hours, or going after promotion, or earning more money. And it might also be a reason why, one of the other things people get mad at is they say, well, how come they can afford a big screen TV? Or I just saw them, they went to the store and bought a bunch of stuff. Well, that's because they're trying to spend the money, so they're not saving it. And so it also encourages people to spend unwisely because they don't want to have all this money stored, because then their benefits will end. And without their benefits, they'll still be working and earning money, but it's not nearly enough to get by. And so this is the poverty trap in action, a labor-leisure budget constraint. The original choice on the labor-leisure budget constraint is $500 an hour of leisure and 2,000 hours of work at point A. So the original choice of 500 hours, which you can see here, this is 500 leisure hours, and then they don't provide you with the numbers down below, but these are the same. So this is 2,500 work hours. This is 2,000, this is 1,500, this is 1,000, this is 500, and this is 0. But anyway, at this point, they're having 500 leisure hours, and they're having 2,000 work hours at point A. And their income is $16,000. With a guaranteed income of $18,000, this family will receive $18,000 whether it provides 0 hours of work or 2,000 hours of work. So if the state says, look, everybody needs to have $18,000 household income, so they're going to get the $18,000 if they are working this 2,000 hours, or if they're providing 0 hours. 0 hours, the 0 hours of work is way back here. Either of those, everybody gets it. So why work the 2,000 hours if you can work 0 hours and still get $18,000? That's a critic of poverty programs, anti-poverty programs would say that. Like this is the evidence. Why would you bother to work if you can, of course, end up just not working at all and still make the $18,000? Only if the family provides, say, 2,300 hours of work does the income rise above the guaranteed level of $18,000. So this is 2,000 hours, this is 2,500, so a little over halfway through. And if we go up, we can see that we get to above $18,000. And they could work the full 2,500 hours, which means they're going to earn $20,000, which is a $2,000 difference. But they're putting in an additional 500 from this 2,000 mark. And the question is that really worth it? And of course, that additional $2,000, 20,000 minus 18,000, divided by the 500 additional hours they would put in is only worth about $4 an hour. So the question is that worth it? And the answer for most people is going to be no. The government could create an anti-poverty program that guarantees $18,000 income even to those who work 0 hours. In addition, every dollar earned means phasing out 50 cents of benefits. This program leads to the higher budget sets shown in the diagram. So you can see here, this was the line that we saw on the previous slide. And on this one, you see a different line that's drawn. And once again, at 0 hours of work, remember the work line is down here, you're receiving $18,000. And then as you gain income, every dollar earned means phasing out 50 cents of the benefits. So the person that's working 500 hours is now going to be at point R here, which is above 25,000. So they're going to be able to make more money than they would have had before, over $7,000 more. So they're not just going to say, oh, gosh, I can just do nothing and still make $18,000, because now they can actually have more available to them. The program will provide incentives to work the same or more hours despite receiving income assistance. But a recipient could choose a point on the new budget set. For instance, they could say, well, under this old program, I could do nothing and make $18,000. And I could still go back to doing that, and have all this leisure time, 2,500 hours, or I could just even work part-time, cut back on my hours, and still make even more than 18,000. For instance, maybe we're just saying this is around 24,000. With less work, more leisure, and greater income. Or part like R, we could do that. We could keep working the same amount of hours and make it $25,000 a year. Or we could work even more hours the whole way up to the point of 28,000. But the question is, how valuable is that leisure time? Near poor is those who have incomes just above the poverty line. And there are a lot of groups like the United Way that have put time and effort into studying this because these people can afford basic necessities. But then if a big medical bill comes up or a big house maintenance cost comes up, they maybe not be able to afford it. So it does decrease standard living or makes them sacrifice other things instead. A safety net is the group of government programs that provide assistance to the poor and near poor. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF as it's called, is one of them that helps provide cash assistance. The Earned Income Tax Credit, a method of assisting the working poor throughout the tax system. And Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, or food stamps, is a federally funded program in which each month poor people receive a card they can use to buy food. And here we can see total expenditures on income security continue to rise between 1988 and 2010. And they don't show you the rest of it here, but it goes back to 1998. And you can see the programs continue to rise in particular. Now, many of these, especially if they're means tested, so they're going to specifically be catering towards poor people that can prove that their income is lower. You can see during the recession, the number of people that are impoverished did increase incredibly. And so other income security programs in particular, and housing and urban development, which is public housing, saw big increases. Payment for TANF or TANF have increased from $13 billion in 1998 to an estimated $17.3 billion in 2013. SNAP has seen relatively small increments. These two programs comprise a relatively small portion of the estimated $106 billion dedicated income security in 2013. Note that other programs and housing programs increased dramatically during 2008 to the 2010 time periods, once again because they were more impacted by the Great Recession. Medicaid, a joint health insurance program between the states and the federal government, provides medical insurance for certain low-income people with a focus on families with children, the elderly, and disabled. It includes the near poor as well as those below the poverty line. This is one of the things I mentioned before. When you're near poor, you can afford basic necessities, but if something big happens, like some kind of medical problem, that eats into that and it might throw you below the poverty line. So programs like Medicaid were developed during the Great Society programs, and one way to distinguish it between Medicare is to remember Medicaid, aid to the poor, Medicare, care for the elderly. So Medicaid is for those that are below or just above the poverty line. Medicaid enrollment and spending, and here you can see the enrollment for adults, 28%, children, 47%, aged 9%, blind and disabled. Now, not surprisingly, blind and disabled and the aged make up bigger proportions of the spending. And children make up a smaller percent because they're not going to have as many healthcare problems. Adults below the elderly age are going to have not that many healthcare problems, so we're not report them. But people in these two groups are going to have a lot more medical expenses. And it shows the Medicaid enrollment by different populations, with children comprising the largest percentage. And that's because children are the age group most likely to be impoverished. So they're going to be enrolled the most on Medicaid or similar programs like CHIP. And it shows that the spending, once again, is on primarily blind and disabled and the aged. Income inequality involves comparing those with high incomes, middle incomes, and low incomes, not just looking at those below or near the poverty line. A quintile is dividing the group into fifths, or 20%, a method economists often use to look at distribution of income. That's when you hear of the top 20%, the middle 20%, the bottom 20%. The Lorenz curve is a graph that compares the cumulative income actually received to a perfectly equal distribution of income. It shows the cumulative share of population on the horizontal axis and the cumulative percentage of total income received on the vertical axis. And this was developed by Max O. Lorenz in 1905, and it helps show income inequality and wealth distribution. And His work as an American economist contributed to this, although it wouldn't technically be called the Lorenz curve until afterwards, and it was actually coined by someone else. But looking at the Lorenz curve, you can see the graph. It graphs the cumulative shares of income received by everyone up to a certain quintile. The income distribution in 1980 was closer to the perfect equality line than the income distribution in 2011. That is, the U.S. income distribution became more unequal over time. So here we can see the income quintiles. This would be the bottom 20%. This would be the top 20%. And this is their share of national income. So you can see the top 20% earns a much higher rate, and the people in the bottom 20% earns a much lower rate. This is the 1980 line. This is the 2011 line. The 2011 line sees that the poorest 20% are receiving much less, although it's much smaller change than you can see in these middle income areas. You can see the middle income between 40 and 60%, that middle quintile, their percent of wealth dropped quite a bit more. A pattern of households with two high earners, one higher earner marries another higher earner, tends to increase the proportion of higher earner households. The number of single-parent households, usually headed by a single mother, has increased, and the poverty rate of these households tends to be relatively high. And single female heads of household typically do have much higher poverty rates, especially when compared to single father heads of households. So single women heads of households, and also minority groups, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, people with lesser education, people in inner cities and isolated rural areas. These are all groups that tend to have higher poverty rates. The earnings of high-skilled labor relative to low-skilled labor have increased. Winner-take-all labor markets result from changes in technology, which have increased global demand for stars. This global demand pushes salaries far above the productivity differences versus educational differences. And it argues that the salary gap between the median and the top 1% is not due to educational differences. So, explaining the point of technology here is that technology has replaced people in the middle income areas that worked in factories with assembly lines, things like that. And so the technology has replaced the human labor. So the availability or the demand for human labor has moved up into the area of professionally educated people and moved down into less skilled areas that can't be done by a machine yet. That still has to be done by a human being, but doesn't require that much training. And so what you've had is the reason why we see this here, maybe isn't because of education, but because of that technology. This used to be filled by factory workers in particular that could earn handsome salaries, but those are less and less in number. So why would wages rise for high-skilled labor? This chart is showing you the quantity of high-skilled labor, so the number of people, and the wage for it. Now, in labor, it's a little bit different. Normally with supply and demand, the demanding is done by individual people as they go and they purchase things from the store's shelves, for instance. But the demand for labor, in this case, are businesses and the government. They purchase labor from people. And so the people are the suppliers. So this is actually being done by businesses and the government. And the supply is actually coming from people selling their labor. So with all this advanced technology, and some people can focus more on education and running this technology in particular, that has increased the demand at all points. This is the old demand curve, and over time the demand has increased. And so that has the potential of garnering higher wages. Now, if the same amount of people that enter this high-skilled area existed, then the wages would have stayed or gone right up to here, and people would have earned more. But this is the law of supply. As the price for something, in this case a wage, increases, the supply increases because there are going to be more suppliers. In the case of a supplier making products like pizza, for instance, if the price of pizza goes way up for like $5 a slice, then a lot more businesses are going to want to produce pizza, and those that already were are going to want to sell more, so the supply goes up. The same is true of people. If the wage for certain types of jobs, high-skilled labor, goes up even more, then more people are going to enter the workforce. So the supply is going to go up. It's going to increase. So the supply curve, the first one, which is marked with a 0, and the second one, which is marked with a 1, this is the supply increase. And so we have an increase of quantity at all points. It looks kind of counterintuitive because it looks like it's going lower, but actually remember quantity is moving to the right. So this is the increased supply curve. And so the wages aren't as high as they could be, but they're still going to be higher than they were in the past. So the combination of the shift in supply and demand led to both an increase in the quantity of high-skilled labor because the new quantity is here, and also a rise in the wage. So from here up to here. If a society decides to reduce the level of income inequality, it has three main sets of tools. Redistribution from those with high incomes to those with low incomes, often done with taxes, trying to assure that a ladder of opportunity is widely available, and particularly a tax on inheritance. Income is the flow of money received, often measured on a monthly or annual basis. Wealth is the sum of the value of all assets, including money in bank accounts, financial investments, and pension fund, and the value of a home. People often get these mixed up, but they're two different things. Income is how much you're earning. Wealth is how much you've accumulated altogether. Redistribution is taking income from those with higher incomes and providing income to those with lower incomes. A progressive tax system helps do that, in which the rich pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes rather than a higher absolute rate. An effective income tax is total taxes paid divided by the total income. The progressive income tax in the United States, for instance, the lowest income earners pay 10% or less, the highest income earners pay 30% or more. And so they pay a higher percentage. Even if you have the same exact rate of 25%, obviously the richer would be paying more amounts of money. But the progressive tax system takes a higher percentage. So it takes even more from the rich. A ladder of opportunity. Even though all children will never come from identical families and attend identical schools, each child has a reasonable opportunity to attain an economic niche in society. Examples of the ladder of opportunity public policy include improved daycare, enriched programs for preschoolers, improved public schools, college loans and grants for those with financial needs, opportunities for training and acquiring new skills, and prohibiting discrimination in job markets and housing. Now, some people would say this one is a legal matter or a de jure matter, so this one should definitely be done. Not a lot of people disagree with that necessarily. Opportunities for retraining and acquiring new skills. This is popular, especially with conservatives, because this is part of welfare to work, which was passed back in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and the Republican Congress. And it requires people to get back to work, and often some unemployment insurances can also offer retraining. So that's popular even amongst conservatives because it's about getting people back to work. This one, of course, is more popular amongst progressives in the Democratic Party on paying for grants. In particular, loans have existed for quite some time. Improving public schools, and this is debate. Some people say that needs to be done with money. Others say, no, it needs to be done with reforms to the current system. And these two are surprisingly controversial, even though throughout a lot of the Western world, for instance, Europe, these are already done, but they're not here in the United States. And there have been some conservatives and some liberals that are able to come together over this because conservatives, of course, want to promote families. And what better way to encourage people to have families than if they're going to have assistance with daycare and getting their kids started in school earlier so they can be helpful in preparing their kids for the future. So there is talk of this happening, and maybe it will occur in the future. When it does, of course, it will incur expense, which is one of the reasons why people will be against it. The estate tax is the tax imposed on the value of inheritance. Applies only to those leaving inheritances of more than $5.43 million. And that's at the national level. There are inheritance taxes that occur at the state level. At the state level in particular, farmers don't like that because this is taxing wealth. And if you're a farmer and you have a couple of big barns and a few pieces of $100,000 farm equipment, then obviously your total wealth is going to be quite valuable. And so it's not difficult for farmers to get up to a higher amount, maybe not $5.43 million for a small family farm, for instance, in northwestern Pennsylvania, but their farm can be worth several $100,000 or maybe even $1 or $2 million. And so the state tax inheritance especially can get into that, and why a lot of people are opposed to the inheritance tax, because it's not just on the richest of people. And the trade-off incentives and economic equality. This is output, and so I've talked before about efficiency versus equity. So efficiency leads to greater output, and equality would be on the horizontal axis. So the more equality that you try to push in, the less efficiency that you're going to have. And society faces a trade-off where any attempt to move toward greater equality, like moving from choice A to B, involves a reduction in economic output. The economic output at point A is here, and if you say let's pass some laws and get some programs that will help reduce equality or start increase equality, we will reduce output to point B. Here you can see the graph on the right is more convex. It's pushing outwards. And so in this graph B, situations can arise like point C, where it is possible to both increase the equality but also increase economic output to a point like choice D. So when it's more convex like this, you can see that as we go up in output to point D, we're also moving outward in equality as well. Point E has just about the same level of output, and so moving out to point E doesn't necessarily harm the output while introducing more equality. It may also be possible to increase equality with little impact on economic output, like the movement from D to E. However, at some point, too aggressive a push for equality will tend to reduce the economic output, as in the shift from E to F. So you might wonder, how do we get one that is more convex like this? Well, that is providing something that has that maximum social benefit, but isn't harming society as much. And so something like public education, instead, if you're just taking money from people and then throwing it at other people, you'll have a curve that looks more like this. But if you have a program like public education that helps everyone, because like I explained earlier, if you have an educated society, you can interact with more educated people. Everyone can read and write. Everyone can do math. It makes employees, it makes businesses more efficient. It makes customers better. And so that causes this to bulge outward, so that way you can achieve that possible outcome where you can have higher output and increase equality at the same time. And just a few other things I'd like to mention about poverty. Two other things I'd like to mention are some issues with poverty, particularly the study of and the calculation of poverty. And there are a few things that they don't necessarily take into consideration. One of them would be in-kind transfers. And this is especially true, not necessarily for poverty, but for the income inequality issue. In-kind transfers are transfers to the poor given in the form of goods and services rather than cash. And so this really isn't calculated in any of that. It isn't calculated in poverty rate, and it definitely isn't calculated when it comes to income inequality. So any type of services they're receiving aren't necessarily taken into consideration. So these non-monetary items can include things like food stamps or housing vouchers, money to purchase housing, or medical services. So those are all examples of in-kind transfers. And according to the Census Bureau, if in-kind transfers were included in income at their market value, the number of families in poverty would be about 10% lower than the standard data indicate. So that's one of the things it doesn't take into consideration. Then we also have mobility. Economic mobility is people moving from one social class to another. And in the United States, it's been a long-standing kind of social aspect that people do have the ability to move from one class to another. Of course, it's also possible to move down. Movements through this income social ladder can be due to good luck or hard work. Movements down the ladder can be due to bad luck or laziness. Some of this mobility reflects transitory variation in income, while some reflects more persistent changes in income. Because economic mobility is so great, many of those below the poverty line are there only temporarily. Poverty is a long-term problem for relatively few families. In a typical 10-year period, about 1 in 4 families falls below the poverty line in at least 1 year. Yet fewer than 3% of families are poor for 8 or more years. Because it is likely that the temporarily poor and the persistently poor face different problems, policies that aim to combat poverty need to distinguish between these groups. So that's one of the other issues. You see, the poverty rate is 12 or 15% right now during the pandemic, some of those people were in poverty already before. Some of them are only there temporarily, and it will be extremely temporarily. It might not even be a year. And so you have to have different types of programming and studies in order to reflect those differences. And the other issue would be economic life. The economic life cycle is the regular pattern of income variation over a person's life. Because people can borrow and save to smooth out the life cycle changes in income, their standard of living in any year depends more on lifetime income than on that year's income. The young, for instance, often borrow, perhaps to go to school or buy a house, but then they repay these loans later when their income rises. People have their highest savings rate when they are middle-aged. Because people can save in anticipation of retirement, the large declines in incomes at retirement need not lead to similar declines in the standard of living. Because your income goes down when you retire, or at least it doesn't grow as much as inflation, especially if you don't get any cost of living adjustments. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more likely to be impoverished because you save so much and put so much aside to help out. Or at that point in your life, you have your mortgage paid off. And so a decline in income or a stagnant income isn't going to hurt you as much as it did earlier. So that is also something that poverty doesn't necessarily take into consideration. And then the last thing I want to talk about are different approaches to poverty. And there are three different schools of thought: utilitarianism, liberalism, and libertarianism. And this can get a little confusing because liberalism in the past used to mean the same thing as libertarianism: small government, limited government, keep out of the way. And in fact, in other countries, you can still hear referred to that. The Libertarian Party in the United States is often identical to the Liberal Party in other countries. But in the United States, these three mean something different. Utilitarianism, let's start with that one first. And this was something that came about earlier on in history by two people that did most of their thinking and expression in the 19th century or 1800s. And that would be Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And they developed the idea of utilitarianism, which is the political philosophy according to which the government should choose policies to maximize the total utility of everyone in society. And utility would be a measure of happiness or satisfaction. So utilitarianism case for redistributing income is based on the assumption of diminishing marginal utility. It seems reasonable that an extra dollar of income to a poor person provides that person with more additional utility than does an extra dollar to a rich person. In other words, as a person's income rises, the extra well-being derived from an additional dollar of income falls. This plausible assumption, together with the utilitarian goal of maximizing total utility, implies that the government should try to achieve a more equal distribution of income. So, someone who's already making $1 million a year isn't going to be a lot more happier, if they're making $1,020,000. So $1 million plus an extra $20,000. But if someone's only making $6,000 a year, they're going to be a lot happier if they get an additional $20,000 and make $26,000. So in other words, if the government just said, hey, let's give every household $20,000 extra dollars a year, that's going to make a lot bigger difference to the person of lower income than it is to the person of higher income. So utilitarian says if we want to get the most maximization of utility or happiness or satisfaction out of society, we need to change the income inequality gap and make sure that greater income is being given to those at the bottom end of the scale. That sounds friendly and nice, but utilitarians, of course, are also in favor of sacrificing the needs of a smaller number of people if it means that you're going to maximize the happiness or utility of society as a whole. So, the needs of the greater population are going to outweigh the needs of a smaller group of people. That's why they don't have a problem with taxing the richer, which is a small group of people, to help out everyone else on the lower end of the scale. And so that might sound good to some people and charitable, but that also goes into other areas of life as well that we don't have time to get into that can make utilitarianism sometimes cold. Liberalism is the next one. It's a political philosophy according to which the government should choose policies deemed to be just as evaluated by an impartial observer behind a veil of ignorance. This was originally developed by John Rawls, who is pictured here. And John Rawls said, basically, when we look out for ourselves and we know we make this much money and we'll have this much success, we're going to develop a tax system or poverty programs or whatever, public policy that is best going to help us. We're not going to develop a public policy program that really helps the extreme poor if we're not poor ourselves. We're not going to have as much sympathy. We're not going to be able to see through their eyes. So how can we possibly understand how to make that happen? And then if we're making $80,000 a year, we're going to say, yeah, let's raise taxes on the rich, but let's only include people above $80,000 a year in that rich category. So he basically said it's impossible for us to develop an impartial system based on that. So he said to imagine a veil of ignorance. That is, that nobody knows exactly where they're going to end up in life. So to pretend, for instance, that you haven't been created yet, you haven't been born, and you could get randomly thrown into any place in the world, to any body. So you don't know if you're going to be born in India or the United States. You don't know if you're going to be born into a poor or rich family. You don't know if you're going to be physically or mentally disabled, or you're going to be in a body that is one of the most intelligent in the world and athletically competitive. So you have no idea what kind of situation you're going to be born into. And so he said, if you put people in that situation, they could be fair-minded. And in that situation, because you have the chance of being born into a low-income family or into a less developed country, or to possibly a situation where you're not going to have the healthiest body or mind, therefore, you are going to be willing to advocate for more generous policies, more liberal policies when it comes to helping the poor or redistributing income. So Rawls would maximize the minimum utility. And Rawls's rule is called the maximum criterion. The maximum criterion is a claim that the government should aim to maximize the well-being of the worst off people of society. So not necessarily for the same reasons that the utilitarians justify, but because he believes that if people didn't know exactly what kind of outcome they were going to have, they would end up helping the poorest of people. And so he believed that this was the most just out of all. And so providing social insurance, government policies aimed at protecting people against risk or adverse events, because that's what everyone would be scared of. If they would say, look, I don't know what my life is going to be like, so I want to protect against the worst case scenarios, people would be in favor of social insurance. The last one I want to mention is libertarianism, and it was advocated especially by 20th century conservative Milton Friedman, but also philosophers like Robert Nozick. And they believe that the political philosophy according to which the government should punish crimes and enforce voluntary agreements but not redistribute income was the best for society. And so this keeps in the most with Adam Smith's idea of classical economics, where the government has a laissez-faire or non-interfering position. And that is actually what is best for everyone. Nozick, for instance, criticized Rawls' liberalism by drawing an analogy between the distribution of income in society and the distribution of grades in a course. Suppose you were asked to judge the fairness of the grades in the economic course you are now taking. Would you imagine yourself behind a veil of ignorance and choose a grade distribution without knowing the talents and efforts of each student? Or would you ensure the process of assigning grades to students is fair without regard for whether the resulting distribution is equal or unequal? For the case of the grades, at least, libertarian emphasis on process over outcome is compelling. Libertarians conclude the equality of opportunity is more important than the equality of income. They believe that the government should enforce individual rights to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity to use his or her talents and achieve success. Once these rules of the game are established, the government has no reason to alter the resulting distribution of income. So they should prevent certain types of actions happening in society that are unfair to individuals, but otherwise they should guarantee the individual rights of people. And the only sense of equality that should be enforced would be the equality of opportunity, that everyone has access to something. Everyone can go out and get a job. Everyone can go out and start a business. That's why libertarians are often opposed to regulation. That's why libertarians want to keep taxes non-existent. If they could, they would get rid of them completely. And therefore, then people are free and unburdened and can go out and do what they want in order to make their own lives. And so that libertarianism basically says if people could do that, then we wouldn't have as much poverty. And libertarians are the biggest to say the only reason why we do have poverty, the only reason why recessions last as long as they do is because of government interference. So, for instance, during the Great Depression, the Secretary of the Treasury under Herbert Hoover basically said, let everybody fail. Let the stock market crash. Let all the businesses go broke. Let all the farms go bust. And so that way people would learn from their mistakes and improve from there on out. And so that is the libertarian approach. And so just like utilitarianism in some respects, it can seem a little cold, but a libertarian would say the pain is short-lived. Human beings are rational and learn their lessons quickly, and therefore the wrongs will be righted. And they say the only reason why the Great Depression was dragged out for so long is because the government kept throwing money at people and they couldn't learn from their mistakes and they couldn't improve. And so they would say, no, actually, our method isn't cold. This is what we do with our children. We don't put them in a bubble. We want them to learn from their mistakes, see their errors can be made, and that people can improve themselves. And the same is true with businesses and employees. They need to be able to do that in order to make a better life. So those are three different schools of thought when it comes to government, or from a libertarian's perspective, interference in the economy, and what we should do involving our public policy in relationship to those of lower income.